Welcome to Embedded. I am Alicia White, here with Christopher White. Our guest is Nick Kartsioukas, here to talk about information security.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for being on the show with us today.
Hello. Thanks for having me here.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am an information security engineer that focuses on infrastructure stuff. My background is in Linux system administration and network engineering, which I've been doing just about half of forever, started back in high school. Kind of have always been interested in the security field, been going to the DEF CON security conference for many years, and then sort of fell into a security engineering role about 3 years ago when I was on loan to a security team as a networking expert. So that's my career thing. At home, I play with electronics and microcontrollers, ham radio stuff, and RC aircraft. And I have a serious problem collecting single board computers and software-defined radio peripherals.
Yes, this is funny because when I mentioned that the Me arm was on sale at Hackaday, Nick got one. And I knew that he didn't really want one, but he had to because, gosh, they were cheap and cool.
Indeed. It's sitting on my shelf. And actually, I bought two.
What kind of attack is that, where you take advantage of somebody's weaknesses?
Hoarding instincts?
Hoarding by proxy.
Yeah.
And you do listen to this show, at least sometimes, right?
Yes.
So you're familiar with Lightning Round?
I am.
That's too bad, because that's not what we're going to do.
Oh, no.
We do have short questions, and we do want short answers, but
Apparently
they're thematically different this time.
Apparently this is Lemur Round.
This is Lightning Lemur Round, yes.
Oh, dear.
Christopher, do you want to go first?
I'm afraid.
Are you afraid you don't know the answers?
I don't know the answers, but that's fine. Where do lemurs live?
Madagascar.
That is correct.
I know because of the movie.
Is the etymology of the word lemur in Latin related to monkeys, ghosts, or giant eyes?
Yes.
They're called spirits of the forest. Let me give you a hint here.
Then I guess I would go with ghosts.
Yes!
Boy, oh boy. What animal was the first in the lemur taxonomy? The ring-tailed lemur, the O'Reilly book lemur. That's not an actual.
Which is actually a tarsier.
See? You should get this. Or giant sloths.
This was an easy question.
I'm going to go with a ringtail.
That is true. Which of these are not a lemur? An eye, an indri, a mouse lemur, or a silky sifaka?
Mouse lemur?
Nope. Trick question. They're all lemurs.
Damn it.
God, you mean. True or false? Their tails are longer than their bodies.
Oh, you guys are mean to me. I don't know.
That one's true. Okay, this is the last one. If you were on Jeopardy and the category was coins and the answer was mouse lemur, what would the question be? This is impossible.
Why are you doing this? She's always wanted to be a game show host, and this is the closest she's going to get.
Oh, no, I laughed too much about it. I forgot what the question was.
Something about Jeopardy.
Coins and mouse lemurs. What upon... Oh, no. How do you answer Jeopardy questions as a question? Right. Can I have a lightning round question, please?
A tip everyone should know.
Always, no, never forget to check your references.
I think the kids like it when I get down verbally, don't you?
Yes.
All right.
See, I thought you were just going to ask questions about Lemur Freed.
You know, if I'd thought of that, it totally would have happened. What is it that you do? I mean, what is an information security person? What is a day in the life of Nick like?
I feel like I'm talking to the Bobs. What would you say you do here?
Look at double rainbow.
As an aside, if you guys know the Star Trek Next Generation episode Darmok, my friends and I communicate in that way, but in movie quotes. So anyway, what is the usual day in the day of Nick? Lots of emails, lots of meetings, lots of consultation tickets. Usually what I do is my team fields questions from other teams within the company about how to do things securely, as far as shipping data back and forth, getting services to talk to each other, authenticating users and services to each other, connecting things to the network, that sort of thing. We also review questions about company security policy and standards and exception requests to those policies, to see if the request makes sense from both what they're asking for and if it's acceptable from a risk management standpoint.
So are you mostly behind the scenes then? Not so much getting involved if there's an emergency, or do they call you when there's some sort of attack in progress as well?
No, I don't work on the incident response side.
That sounds good.
And you work for a fairly large company. I know we're not going to say which company because you are here representing yourself, not them. But it is a big company that has internal stuff and external stuff and customer stuff. And so it sounds like you mostly work on the internal teams working with each other on how they're going to deal with customers. Is that correct?
Yeah. So either the team's producing services that are customer facing or services that are consumed by others within the company. So we have a lot of internal company services for all kinds of different things, just from the basic like email and patching services to build services, code storage, that sort of thing.
Okay. I want to ask you specific questions, but I don't know. Can you give me an example that I can ask questions about? It doesn't really have to be real.
So it would be if a customer, if we have a team that is transferring data to a third party, or how a customer would interface with a service, and how their data would be handled internally, what sort of protections would be around it, what kind of authentication methods would be used for the customer to authenticate to that service to then do whatever it is they're going to do. And then the nature of the data that's being presented to the customer, if we need to have any particular protections around that or requirements around customer authentication to see that data.
Okay. I like this. Yes, this is the sort of example I wanted. Okay, so we have customers and they have a bunch of different data. And some of that data can go to third parties and some of it can't. And you definitely should ask the customer before you do these things, because that's just privacy 101. But where does security come in here? Is it just a matter of customers changing their password, or is there some back-end thing that we should know more about?
So there are a lot of back-end services that deal with storage of customer data, whether the type of the data it is, whether it's being stored encrypted at rest or not, whether or not it's being encrypted in transit. And for exchanging data with third parties, there are additional security reviews we do of those third parties to make sure they adhere to the same security policies and standards that we do as far as treatment of data, be it customer or corporate internal data or IP, that sort of thing.
How do you learn these things? I mean, it's got to be a pattern, because you're going to have these recommendations for the third parties, and it's going to be things like don't store passwords in plain text, but a lot more detail than that. How do you learn what the best practices are?
So there are a number of guides out there for companies to base their internal policies on. We have our own policies that we have developed and maintain internally, based on those external guides and what we consider to be appropriate treatment of data, and kind of how we view customer data. Some of the other guides out there, there's the the CIS 20 critical security controls that involve things like make sure you know what's on your network, make sure you are authenticating users appropriately, controlling admin privileges, that sort of thing. And those are kind of more general, those guidelines. And you can take those and sort of drill down and apply them to specific services and products and such within your own environment.
All right. That makes sense. I still feel like it's a bit of a wall. Like, what are the security best practices? Can you just sum that up in like 10 minutes?
So it depends. It depends on what sort of data you're handling. For example, if you are just handling, say, comments for a web page or a web forum or something that's a public forum, that's going to be vastly different than the kind of practices you would have in place if you're handling payment instruments, like credit card numbers and such. So kind of where you start out is kind of classifying your data and what you're doing with it, and identifying your what sort of threats you would expect to your data. So getting together what's called a threat model, basically figuring out what your risks are, what your acceptance of risk is, and those will factor into how in-depth you want to go into security controls. Whether you want to say all the things must be encrypted all the time on everything, and in order to access it, you have to go through the Maxwell Smart style 8 doors, one of which slams on you, and then enter a secret key into the thing and drop down into the cone of silence where it's whispered to you in another language, versus just, it's posted on a web page for all to see.
Yeah, you sent me a link to the EFF Assessing Your Risks page. And it was pretty interesting because it goes through, well, what are you protecting? How likely is it other people will want it? Who are you protecting it from? Is it okay if casual people get it, or guests or family members? And then there's the, how much trouble am I willing to go through to prevent any consequences should I fail to protect it? And so it's a good way of categorizing what you're doing, even if it isn't, it isn't tactical advice. It isn't you should do this with it. It's well, why are you bothering sort of questions, the assessing the risks part.
So just to jump in for a second, here's one of the problems I have with security, and it's very confusing to me. When working on medical stuff, we used to do a risk analysis. So it would be this big spreadsheet, and we'd have a device, and we'd say, okay, these are the things that can go wrong. This would be the effect on the patient. And then we'd have another column. This is how we're mitigating it. And you'd have to give this to the FDA and say, look, we've thought about these risks. Here's how severe we think they are, and here's how they're either not a problem, or here's what we're doing to make sure they're not a problem. The stuff with security information kind of feels nebulous to me because there's all these attacks. You might think that the customer's data is not interesting. Like, let's say it's step data from a track, a fitness tracker or something, or just some very mundane kind of information. But I've seen a lot of attacks where people can synthesize with enough of that data private information. Same thing with like web surfing. Like, oh, I don't need to see your bookmarks, but I can glean from, I don't know, something your browser's doing that seems completely unrelated and produce it in a way to identify you personally.
This is like when Target knows you're pregnant before you know you're pregnant.
And I don't even know if that particular case was true, but it's this kind of, we're going to apply all kinds of inference to boring data. So I guess my question is, where can you draw the line anymore?
So the matrix that you mentioned actually is used in information security as well for risk analysis. So in terms of, let's say there's an announcement of an exploit against some software operating system, whatever. So the way you would look at that is, what is the likelihood of that exploit being exploited, and what is the level of impact if it is exploited? And then based on those, you look at your mitigations. You can say, okay, I'm going to patch that. I'm going to reduce access to that service to reduce the likelihood of exploit. I'm going to reduce the data set that's available to that service to reduce the impact. Or it may just be that whatever this is, companies can say that we accept the risk of this, as long as that's documented somewhere and they have a good understanding of what it is they're accepting the risk of. That may be a valid business choice. When you talk about inference of data from lesser data sets, that gets into, I think, the likelihood of exploit category.
Okay.
Where it is possible to do those sorts of things. The question is, how much effort does it take to do it? And is it worth it to an attacker to take advantage of the level of effort to get that data? And then, how much is that going to be worth to them after spending that effort? And what is going to be exposure to any of the owners of that data after it's been, de-anonymized or whatnot in that context?
Okay, that makes sense. So you can do a real risk analysis with that based on an assessment of the value of the attack.
Yep.
Okay, so there's always been this don't rule your own crypto, which I totally believe in.
Hey, Rot 13 forever.
Twice.
But how do I even know what crypto's out there? Do you have a good reference for figuring out what sorts of crypto will work in which scenarios? I mean, I can't use the latest super duper thingy, Crypto Bob, in my embedded system, but I don't want to just use Rot 13. There's got to be something in between.
Yep. Embedded systems are particularly difficult with crypto. I've seen this with little embedded network infrastructure devices, where as new versions of TLS are developed, TLS is what SSL kind of grew up into. There are harder and harder crypto operations for the new ciphers that are released. And then best practice is to disable many of the older versions of TLS and disable the weaker ciphers because maybe there are weaknesses in them, or they're just, they're not of a level of security that is sufficient for whatever you're doing. And trying to do elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman on an 8-bit micro is just not going to happen. I guess I wasn't really providing any info, just agreeing with you.
Do you have a book, a starter book?
So there is a book that just came out that I have started reading through, which is Serious Crypto by, who is it? Serious Cryptography by Jean-Philippe Aumasson. And that is published by NoStarch Press. And it kind of goes over the fundamentals of cryptography. And when you think about crypto, there is a lot of math involved. Generally, if you are taking an existing implementation or some reference design you don't need to understand every little internal bit of the machine, as far as like, for example, AES has a bunch of internal working parts. It's an encryption algorithm that does a bunch of stuff. I don't know all that bunch of stuff. I know the different modes that it can operate in, such as like blockchaining mode or different streaming modes. And knowing kind of those operations and when they're best used is kind of what you kind of need to know as an implementer. And so a book like this, Serious Cryptography, would kind of go into that and describe, these are different modes of encryption. These are when you would use symmetric crypto. This is when you would use asymmetric or public-private key cryptography. This was when you would use these stream ciphers or block ciphers, that sort of thing.
Okay. That is sort of what I wanted to know, yes. On the other hand, I feel like all of crypto and security is kind of pointless. I mean, I don't really want to say that because I know that's a lot of your job, and I'm that's not good. But
it's also false. So that's good.
Every time I hear about these exploits, like this Specter and what was it, Meltdown, these processor level exploits, there's no way we're going to repair. Well, and I'm just like, God, there's nothing I can do. There's no winning. Even Alice in Wonderland and the Red Queen and running constantly but getting nowhere, I'm still falling way behind. Help me.
Stop reading the news.
Yes. So first off, don't panic. There is a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in headlines relating to security news. Don't panic. There are always going to be exploits discovered. It's always going to be a cat and mouse game. With the Meltdown and Specter exploits, we're kind of paying for assumptions that were made in computing a long time ago that have been carried forward, which is you are the only person that is going to be running code on this processor, and it will always be under your complete control. And if you look at just a web browser, you're running JavaScript, plugins, etc. That's all stuff fed to the browser from some third party that you have no control over, and the browser is just happily executing away. So just, yeah, it sounds kind of like, from the way I'm describing it, we should be panicking, but don't. There are things you can do to mitigate issues. Just like as an end user, a couple of the best things you can do are use a password manager and use two-factor authentication. Password manager gives you, randomly generated strong passwords across multiple sites, and just use one strong password to log into your password manager. Use a two-factor authentication token or app or SMS code to help prevent that password from being phished or otherwise captured. And that will go a long way to mitigating end-user risks, at least on your own machine at home.
I like that. One of my New Year's resolutions last year was to get a password manager, and I did, and I became a convert, and then I started talking about it and trying to convert everybody else. And I thought having a password manager would be annoying because I'd have to change all my passwords, which were many of them the same and really not that great. But now I have stronger passwords and they aren't the same. And I have this feeling that if you use the same password between different sites, it's sort of like reusing the same Kleenex from different people, which is just horrifying. And I have some two-factor authentication, but then I hear that password managers are being hacked.
Well,
It's not like, credit union or credit. Anyway, do I have to worry about that too? Or can I just say, look, I've done a good job. I actually paid for one, so it's not like I'm just using the worst one, and I didn't write my own, so I don't have to support it. Is that good enough, really? I mean, is Password Manager third party good enough?
For most people, I think so. Again, it depends on your threat model. If you are, say, Edward Snowden, your threat model is going to be slightly different. There's a paper written kind of about threat modeling and threat assessment in it's written sort of in an amusing style by James Mickens. It's called This World of Ours. And at one point it says, well, you're either dealing with Mossad or not Mossad. If your adversary is not Mossad, then you'll probably be fine if you pick a good password and don't respond to emails from cheapest pain pills virtualbasket.biz.ru. If your adversary is the Mossad, you're going to die and there's nothing that you can do about it.
No, I think that's, that's an extreme way to look at it, but it is a good way to look at it. And I think one of the things people don't do enough is analogize their normal physical security with computer security, because we have houses with locks and
windows. And you could have a house without windows and it'd be a lot more secure.
All kinds of exploits to get into a house, but we do say this is the limit, given our, like you said, our threat model, that there aren't people trying to get into our house every single day to kill us or steal things, then, okay, this is as far as I need to go to prevent casual people. So finding the right balance is probably a little trickier with computer security, but...
And also on that same analogy, there are things you can do with your house where you make it a less attractive target to, say, a burglar casing your neighborhood.
Right.
You have a security camera up. You have a dog at home that barks a lot at anybody approaching the house. You have little signs that say this house protected by whatever security company. When somebody sees that and then they see a house down the street that has its side window open all day long when people go off to work, they're going to pass up your house and go to that other easier target. If you're using two-factor authentication, it's going to make phishing your passwords a whole lot harder, and your accounts are just going to be passed over.
Okay. Two-factor authentication. I'll do more of that. I don't have it set up on everything.
I use 10-factor authentication.
Should we talk about why it's called two-factor authentication with the whole biometrics and what you have and what you are and what you know?
Yep. Sure. So
go ahead.
So yeah, there are the various factors. There's something you know, which is usually a password, something you have, which can be a security token, like a USB plug-in thing or an app on your phone. And then there's something you are, which is your thumbprint, biometric scan of your eye.
Christopher's face.
Your DNA, Christopher's face, your voice. Hi, my name is Werner Brandes. Again, movie references. So the way I do things on my phone is I have a strong unlock pin that I use all the time to unlock my phone. And then I have my password manager on my phone that requires an additional verification step that requires me to use Touch ID to unlock the password manager. So that's sort of the way you can go is having a second factor to authenticate yourself to a service. One of the issues I have with biometrics is if your token is compromised, it's very hard to replace your fingerprints. Depending on the implementation of the biometric verification system, it might not be storing that data in a secure way. It might not be storing the data in a way that keeps collisions from happening. For example, at a previous job, I had used this biometric hand scanner where you would punch in a PIN, which was basically not really the something you know token. It was just essentially your username. And then you would put your hand in the scanner. And so it was one-factor biometric authentication. And heard a talk at DEF CON several years ago of a guy that had this and was playing around with it at his house. And his neighbor came over, and the guy was setting up his neighbor to watch his plants for the weekend or something. And his neighbor had punched in the guy's PIN instead of his own, scanned his hand, and it unlocked the door. Because that particular biometric scanner only registered like 9 points of data for your hand geometry. So that's, not really enough. But
so that suggests that people should, if they use biometrics, be aware of the implementation to some degree.
Yes, definitely. Things like the iPhone Face ID and Touch ID. I'm not as familiar with the Face ID stuff yet. I've looked into Touch ID, and the way it stores the data in the secure enclave is rather nice.
Yeah, I think Face ID it stores it in the same place, but whether it's less or more of a one-way kind of thing.
Yeah, and the way it registers facial geometry, right, that sort of thing, would be interesting to look at, as I have heard about collisions. Anyway. So yeah,
I can't open Christopher's phone anymore with my face, but we haven't tried it on your brother. I would be interested in seeing.
I don't think it'll work on him.
But have you tried wearing a Christopher mask?
We don't have one of those.
So that's biometrics. Something you have, there are security tokens, YubiKey. Or Yubico makes the YubiKey.
Oh, yes. I used to have one of those, and then it would have a different number all the time, and I'd have to type in the number before it changed, and then after a little while they would get out of sync, and it'd be very exciting. Yeah, that was a good introduction to time syncing problems.
So they're the ones that show a little number on them. Those are time-based. There are actually also ones that are just counter-based that have the little display on them. Those have sync problems. If you have it in your pocket and the button gets pressed a bunch of times, it gets way ahead of what the server is expecting your next token to be. So yeah, those are things you have. There are also USB ones that you plug in, and they will generate one-time passwords. Or there's a universal two-factor, or U2F, which actually performs a secure two-way handshake with the site you're authenticating to. So the first time you register it, you perform a key exchange, and then it does crypto hand-wavy stuff, because I haven't looked into the implementation details of U2F. But it performs a secure negotiation to authenticate you to the service after that, between this little secure enclave on your USB drive and whatever you're connecting to. There's also the time-based one-time code apps for your phone, like Google Authenticator and the like. Those are pretty good. Again, if your threat model is somebody putting malware on your phone and then sniffing the memory of that application and getting all your OTP keys, that could be a problem. And then the
most popular one is SMS, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's what I get. Everybody that wants me to do two-factor authentication wants to send me a text whenever I log in, or whenever I log in from a new location.
Yep, that one is the most common. That one has been seeing a lot of exploitation recently due to people taking advantage of phone company tech support. So
I call up and I say,
I am Christopher, and my phone broke. I wish to move my number over to this other IMSI or this other SIM card ID. And they say, okay, because we're helpful.
Okay, so there's the whole problem right there.
Yes. So it's finding the weak point and exploiting it. There is, once you get a human in the mix, you can,
So sounds like the solution is destroy all humans.
Helpful people are the worst.
I know, right? So that has happened, and there have been some stories of that in the news in recent months. But again, it depends on your threat model. It requires a lot more effort because you need somebody to call and spend time on the phone and try and, argue with somebody, or maybe call back several times, try and get somebody different that might be more helpful. So if it's just, I'm trying this for this list of 20,000 people I have, it's not as likely to happen versus I am targeting these specific 5 people.
Yeah, you'd have to have something you really wanted from my account before you'd be willing to spend an hour on the phone with my phone provider.
Yep. What seems to be the most common recently is Bitcoin exchange sites. So people that have all their Bitcoin in an exchange site wallet online that uses SMS two-factor auth, they'll go after that and then drain their Bitcoin and run off and do whatever it is you do with Bitcoin with it.
Attempt to liquidate it, which probably takes several days or something.
Yeah. And in the meantime, somebody fishes your Bitcoin account and, the circle continues.
All right. So that all makes sense. But I want to go back to the processor thing that happened recently.
Okay.
Could somebody explain what happened? I mean, all I know is that suddenly my processor is vulnerable to things, and it wasn't just Intel, and it was everybody. Except the Cortex M's, because they're the best.
No, because they don't have any fancy, fun hardware that makes me go fast.
The Cortex R's, though, apparently are potentially vulnerable.
Yeah.
Well, they're A's, basically.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I thought they were more similar to the M's. Never mind. Interesting. I have to look into those.
No, it's a pair of A's playing together.
Oh, and they're in lockstep?
Or voting.
Or something.
Huh, cool. Okay. Anyway, so as processor designers tried to find ways of making their processors faster, and they were running into limits of the clock speeds they could get on the process size at the time, they started looking into ways of maybe, instead of just making it go faster and faster and faster, utilize all the bits of the processor at the same time if they could. So if you have a bit of the processor that does integer math and a bit of the processor that does floating point math, maybe you could, if you had 2 operations that were one doing integer math, one doing floating point math, instead of doing them, do one and then the next, maybe you just stick them both into their respective chunks of the processor. And I will wave my hands and say, I'm sorry if this sounds super confusing, because I am really not familiar with deep processor architecture stuff. So you guys need to keep me honest.
To the best of our abilities.
So far, you're good. For very long instruction word microarchitecture, that's what they do. And
this is why clock speeds haven't gone up, but processor speeds have. I mean, clock speeds have gone up some, but
partially. Yeah.
It used to be clock speeds would go up
dramatically,
a lot.
Yeah, double every year or something.
And now they don't double that fast.
Yeah, what we're seeing more is slightly higher clock speeds, slightly lower power consumption, but still seeing some performance increase that's not proportional to just those adjustments.
And it is due partially to this parallelization and partially due to bigger caches.
Yep.
If I understand correctly. Okay.
And then you can also do pipelining, which I read a bunch about this morning and promptly mostly forgot. So you can have multiple stages of execution through your processor where you'll have an instruction that needs to do several things. instead of just waiting for it to get through all of its several things. As it gets through the first thing, you send a second instruction in, and they go and you kind of fill up this pipeline of operations.
So I learned about pipelining on a TI DSP a decade and a half ago or something. And it was really great when we were doing signal processing, where I would have to do a filter. And I worked on a multi-rate filter, so I was changing things from like 47 kilohertz to something not equally divisible, like 9 kilohertz. And you have to go up and then down in like one step. And it's a very complicated filter. It's a lot of math, but it's the same math over the signal. You just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And the only time that you don't do this thing is when an oddity occurs and you have to restart the filter, or you have to do, you have to change the filter coefficients. And so it's very mechanical once it's in place. And sometimes there's fine tuning on the fly. And so it isn't something you could just put in hardware, but you are just doing the same. I mean, totally boring, exactly what processors should do. Very boring things, not like machine learning. And so the pipelining there makes a ton of sense because, okay, I'm going to multiply this and then I'm going to add that and then I'm going to multiply this and then I'm going to add that. And it's just going to be over and over again. And the TI processor would stack up like 4 samples worth of math operations. And as long as I didn't change anything, it would go as fast as possible. But if I changed anything, then I lost all of that pipeline. And the reason that you can't necessarily run at pipeline speeds is because RAM is much slower and flash is much slower than the processor itself. So you want to get all of these things into the fastest registers you can and get them all lined up to go, as though you were doing that pendulum thing with the marbles, and you start on one end and it clicks all the way through and it jumps up to the other end. That's kind of what the pipeline is. You just want it to go all the way through, and you want it to keep going over and over again. So, yeah, pipelining.
Yep.
That's it in a nutshell.
And so if you have a branching instruction,
ifs, whiles, fors, anything that may change the execution,
you can, what would normally happen is you would see that and go, okay, that is conditional upon the result of some operation that is currently in the pipeline. I'm going to hang on and wait. That pipeline is going to empty. I'm going to see the result and then continue on and refill the pipeline. That's not very efficient. You're losing your pipeline there. So what you can do is say, okay, the last time this happened, this is the result I got. And so I'm going to go on the assumption that that is the result I'll see this time. And
it isn't always last time. You can sometimes write your code so that, like, if you write your code, if there is an error, then do this. It may always do that. I mean, you have a long list of things that are happening, and somewhere in there you have if there is an error, and you can choose to put it if there is an error or if there is not an error, and then fill in the next thing however you want. And the compiler may speculatively execute one way or the other. I mean, it may.
Well, we're getting ahead of it. The compiler doesn't do any of that. That's the chip.
Right, the chip. But I mean, this isn't new. The speculative execution was always part of pipelining.
Well, let's talk about what that. You skipped to it.
Oh,
so he was getting to it.
Oh, Nick, go ahead. Sorry.
Yep. So
I know all this stuff. I'm so excited. I didn't think I would know anything about this, but this is all old chip stuff. But okay, speculative execution. So go ahead. Lemurs of Madagascar.
Branch prediction and speculative execution are the chip's way of making assumptions, usually based on past behavior and past results, and saying, okay, this is what I think is going to happen, so I'm going to start doing this and just keep the pipeline going. If that turns out to not be a valid assumption, I can just throw that away and start over again. I'm going to lose a bit of pipeline stage process in the meantime, which will, maybe slow it down a little. But if that's correct, then I don't have to perform that wait for the result. It's just there. It's already done.
So instead of losing the pipeline either way, you are losing the pipeline only for one path.
Yep.
And to make things more complicated, if you have more than one pipeline,
right,
you can stage the speculative execution somewhere else and toss out one of them, but one pipeline is unaffected.
Yeah.
So where Meltdown and Specter come in is taking advantage of speculative execution and cache timing attacks. So cache timing attacks, your cache is a place where your processor stores recent stuff. Memory addresses it's accessed recently, et cetera, et cetera. And cache is way faster than RAM, which is way faster than flash.
You left some ways out there, but okay.
I said way, so it's long way. Okay. Anyway. So you have your most recently accessed data there. If you are trying to understand what some other process has done, you can ask the processor to perform some different operations. And if it takes a while to come back, you know, okay, this was not in the cache. If it comes back right away, oh, this was cached. So I know that whatever something else was doing, it recently did this operation. So you basically perform a timing-based attack using things that are in the cache or not in the cache to see what has happened recently. So so
for my filtering example, that would be I would have recent data in the cache, and I would have whatever my filter coefficients were in the cache. And if you looked at the cache, you might be able to say, oh, the system's in this state right now.
You can't really look at the cache.
Oh, I thought that was what he was saying.
No,
was that it was...
you can ask questions about the cache.
You can't ask questions about the cache. You can just ask the processor to do things.
Right.
And based on how long it takes,
exactly,
you know whether or not it's in the cache.
It's really subtle.
Wow. Okay, so it's not that my data is in the cache. It's that if you tried to run something else and it was fast, you know it must be that data that's in the cache. And if it's slow, then that data wasn't in the cache.
But there's an additional complication here, because the important part is privilege levels.
Yes. So modern CPU architectures have multiple privilege levels. Usually you see them referred to as rings. Like an Intel x86 CPU has ring 0, which is the most privileged. And that's where the kernel lives, the kernel being the operating system that gets access to all the things. And then usually ring 3 is user level stuff, user space. So, my own unprivileged applications that I'm running. In hypervisor-based systems, there's a ring -1, which is the hypervisor that lives there so that virtualized systems can operate at ring 0 and so forth.
Okay.
And then if you look at the Intel management engine stuff, it's like -2 or -3, which is a whole different ball of wax we can talk about later if you want. Anyway, so the privilege rings, a lower privileged ring is not permitted to cross a boundary into a higher privileged ring. So user space stuff is not supposed to be able to access kernel space stuff, and that is enforced within the CPU architecture.
But this isn't like when I type sudo edit something in Linux. And it's not like when I'm in Windows and say, yes, allow this executable to change my system. Those are all happening still in user space. This is at the processor level. So this is different, right?
Yes. Well, sort of. So this is at the kernel level. So this is where the processor, this is where the operating system is doing things like, let's say, on a Windows machine that has BitLocker encryption enabled. The kernel is the one managing the disk encryption operations and the encryption key for the disk. And as a user, you're not supposed to be able to touch that memory. The kernel can, present that data to the user through various ways. But as just like a user performing a syscall to read that memory location out, you can't do that.
Okay, so I have rings, I have priorities. If I'm in the user ring, I can't interface directly to the kernel ring. I have to go through the correct APIs.
Yep. Like various syscalls are usually what get you through to the kernel to request things from it.
So is this attack having to do with the cache timing running in the user ring and noting the cache that is on the kernel ring?
So the way it works is, one more important thing. If you're attempting to access ring 0 things from ring 3, you will get an exception thrown by the processor. It will say, no, you can't do that.
Is the exception cause a blue screen or a reset or handled by the kernel, or is it handled by the user ring?
My guess is you'd probably just, your program would crash.
Yeah, I don't.
Be denied.
It would be like when I said printf and I'm printfing to the wrong thing and it gives me an error and I just ignore it.
Yeah.
Well, somewhere in there. The system wouldn't crash, no.
Okay. Well, I mean, because if you were a Snoopy user snooping into the kernel and it crashed,
right,
then we wouldn't have this problem. Okay.
But then you'd be giving people easy ways to crash people's computers.
Yep.
Is that better or worse? No, let's finish this. Okay.
Okay, so what you can do is craft a program that will, at a high level, it allocates some memory, and then says, okay, now do some things, and then copy this somewhere else, and then it performs some bitwise operation during the copy using a bit of kernel memory space.
Right.
Branch history buffer. Hey, I'm looking this up.
So if you write it correctly, when that gets optimized through in the processor and when it gets set up for its execution path using to get pipelined, and then the speculative execution stuff does its thing, the check to see if you are allowed to read that kernel space doesn't happen until after the operations that you have requested are completed.
Right.
But the data doesn't get returned to you because then the check happens and the exception gets thrown. However, at that time, the operation that you requested to happen has already been processed through and is present in the cache. So then when you go and pull... So you check two different memory addresses. You ask for an allocation in two different spaces. Basically, you request a memory allocation, and the address is dependent on one bit of a memory location of kernel space.
Okay.
And so then you go and request those two memory locations that you have potentially allocated. And if the response comes back faster, that's the bit was in the chunk of memory that you requested from the kernel. And so you perform this over and over and over, iterating through and retrieve one bit at a time of a chunk of kernel memory. And if
Which won't take that long if you know what you're doing.
If you know within the kernel where something is stored, you can go after a password, a key, whatever you want, and you can go and grab it. Now, modern kernels use address space layout randomization, which is supposed to randomize where things are within kernel memory. So you can't predict where things happen. Related to this paper is another paper about bypassing kernel address space layout randomization. So if you can predict where things in the kernel are, and then exploit this particular cache timing attack that lets you get stuff that you target things within the kernel.
Is it my imagination, or is this really complicated?
It's extremely complicated. And it's one of the reasons that I'm not able to be angry. I mean, everybody's saying, oh, Intel, these morons. Linus came out and had this whole Linus-y rant about how terrible Intel is and morons.
Linus.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm looking at this and having read some of the paper and the explanations, I'm like, okay, so yeah, they came up with something 15, 20 years ago. And some researchers have been thinking really, really hard with unbounded resources for the last 2 decades on how maybe to work their way through this. There's no way to win. Nobody was going to sit down with their processor microarchitecture and come up with this attack while they're designing a processor. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think we're being unfair.
This didn't hit the risk assessment, did it?
No. Because again, at the time that these processors were being designed, also the assumption was, okay, this is a processor that you're going to run in a desktop or something, and you're the user running things, you're the user owning the code, all that, and the environment has changed. I just read something this morning about the Itanium architecture.
Oh, God.
Where it exposed the pipelines to the underlying OS, and it was up to the OS to implement its own speculative execution, which is kind of interesting, which would allow you to do some interesting things on the OS side to, figure out how you want to do speculative execution across security boundaries or not, that sort of thing. AMD is not vulnerable in general to the meltdown vulnerability because it doesn't perform speculative execution across security boundaries, is my understanding. I could be wrong.
Well, one of the things I saw about Intel is it's one of the special caches, and there's no distinction between user space and kernel space things within it. So some of the memory mappings, it just shares them. And I think that's the root of the problem with the Intel stuff, is that in order to make things go really fast, they didn't make separate page tables. And I'm not sure that AMD does that. But Specter sounds like the same thing. So everybody's vulnerable to this. AMD,
anything that uses basically anything, speculative execution,
anything modern,
except the Raspberry Pi,
which isn't modern. I'm raising my hand and saying no.
Anything not Cortex M.
No, I'm saying that the TI DSPs had this speculative execution and pipelining, but it didn't have the kernel and ring and priority and many people using it.
Okay,
this is a problem because there are cloud computers, right?
No, this is a problem because you have privilege levels.
No, if I was running on my computer, it wouldn't matter.
Yes, it would.
But browsers run code.
Yes, JavaScript.
Oh, see, I really thought this was sort of a cloud problem because that's where you have lots of users on one computer, but
it's more of a problem for them, but it's still a problem.
I mean, that assumes that I leave a browser application running for long enough for it to identify everything about my kernel.
The browser ones. So Specter is more general speculative execution based. It allows process to divulge information about memory that it has.
So that's kind of a user space to user space thing. Like one browser tab could ask about the contents of another browser tab, or
what else I'm running,
right?
Which is something I really don't want. I don't want them to look at my Skype or email programs.
So Firefox just rolled out an update that has a mitigation for the issue. And then Chrome has a setting you can toggle that provides site-to-site process isolation that also mitigates the issue. As far as the general internal mechanics of Specter versus Meltdown, those I'm not too sure of.
Yeah, it's fuzzy to me. But, it sounds like, for the most part, Meltdown has already been patched. Apple's already released a patch before the exploit had been publicized.
But Intel's CEO is too busy selling stock. Oh, that was mean.
Intel's not going to release a patch. It's Microsoft.
Intel, right. I think, is releasing a microcode patch also to help
BIOS.
To kind of help patch. The issue. Okay. Yeah. I think that one, I don't know if that's going to be for Meltdown, Specter, or both. Of course, the fun with microcode patches is...
You're altering your processor. Everything's fine.
Yeah, and also... You're not just altering your processor. The way to apply the patch, usually microcode patches are applied through system BIOS updates. Do you know anyone that updates their BIOS?
Yeah.
No.
I updated my BIOS on my laptop a lot trying to get the screen to stop flickering, but once it stopped flickering enough, I stopped paying attention to BIOS.
Yeah. And then even more than that, do you know any companies that release BIOS updates for any systems that are more than 2-3 years old?
No.
Why would they?
Yeah, so this is the problem, because the advice from security people often is, we'll just keep your system up to date, apply patches, which is fine if they're available.
And even if they're available, that advice doesn't apply in all environments. If you are a hospital...
medical.
Yes. First off, you have devices that are life safety critical that you can't necessarily just reboot every Tuesday. Second, you have vendors that need to go through all that fun validation stuff in order to release an update. And that is a ton of work on them, which they're not just going to do every patch Tuesday, go off to the FDA and say, oh, hey, by the way. You have industrial control systems where you have to really vet the patches for what it's going to do to your system, industrial and scientific stuff. Yeah, all of these environments where, you hear about these compromises and everyone just says, oh, you should have patched. Well, you're not familiar with their environment. They couldn't have necessarily just patched.
On the other hand, a lot of those things shouldn't be connected to networks.
That is true. There are a lot of issues with how networks are set up together, how you handle trust boundaries and what is permitted to connect to each. But even with, isolated networks, look at, I forgot the name of it. What was that crazy industrial control targeting one?
The SCADA one?
Yeah, that targeted the Iranian refinery plant.
Yes, Stuxnet.
Stuxnet, yes.
Yeah.
So all of those systems were completely isolated. Somebody basically dropped a USB key in a parking lot, and it got plugged in. And
somebody who shall remain named CIA or NSA.
Once again, if the Mossad wants your data. If you look into the way that Stuxnet worked, it becomes really obvious just how targeted it was. And the intel available to those that created it in order to target it thusly. Yeah. It's an interesting read if you read up on it.
I think that, some of the takeaway from some of the security discussions is, if you're a very prized, unique, singular target, there's all kinds of things that are going to be done to try to get to you that won't be applied to the general public.
So things like hospitals and industrial controls stuff, network isolation, set up least privilege accounts, having every machine on the network logged in as admin is not necessarily the best thing. There are lots of things that can be done. Always, defense in depth is what we always try for, is have as many layers as you can to reduce impact and reduce likelihood of something happening.
All right. So I missed the ending. Is somebody coming at me through my browser? Should I deal with this, or can I put my head back in the sand where it's super comfortable?
I think Microsoft's already got a patch for Meltdown, and there are already patches for browsers either coming in the next week or.
Yep. So if you have your system at home, update your software, patch your system. If you have a system running in a hospital, don't browse the internet from anything on any life safety critical device.
That's a permanent thing, not right now. I mean, just for right now.
That's just in general. In general,
like to watch
don't
Netflix
do
on the MRI.
Yeah. I was thinking somebody like loading Yahoo News on their IV drip machine.
Sure.
Yeah, why not? Apply patches. One thing that I found is unfortunately almost necessary these days is an ad blocker. I use uBlock Origin because ads are just proven to be again and again a terrible vector for
the mosquitoes
malware
of the internet.
Antivirus, anti-malware. There's a site, av-comparatives.org, that has just basically comparisons of different antivirus products tested against various malware samples. What else can you do? Yeah, password manager, set up two-factor authentication. Not necessarily what you would think of as security related, but part of information security is availability. Keep backups. Backups are very important, especially as you see a lot more prevalence of CryptoLocker type malware, which will take your data and just encrypt it and then ransom it for some sum of money before they give you the decryption key. Keep backups. There's with backups a 3-2-1 rule. 3 copies of your data on 2 different types of media, and at least one of them offsite. So have your computer with either a local network or attached disk to do your backups locally, and then find some cloud-based backup provider that does encryption of your data, preferably for whom you can provide your own encryption key. Zero knowledge is the catchphrase to look for.
And that means that I provide my own encryption key, and they can't look inside my data.
Right. All they get is a blob that they store, and none of any of your data is presented to them. If you set up two-factor auth, if you're doing a U2F token, get 2, register them both, and stick one in a fire safe. If you're using an app on your phone, also put the app on a tablet and have both of them set up for the same sites. So if your phone dies, you can still get into all your services. They also usually have one-time use codes that you can print out and just kind of stick those in a safe. Yeah. Cool. Don't panic.
It's hard because you do hear all this stuff and on one hand it is like home security. Like, I'm not going to make myself an attractive target. That's a goal. On the other hand, it's as though one person could case 1 million homes an hour. And so it just is, the automation in it is hard. It makes it a little scarier than a home security to me.
If they're casing 1 million homes an hour, though,
then they're going after the easy.
In order for them to, then it takes like, say, 10 seconds for most targets, but some of the targets take 5 minutes. That's a big difference when you multiply it across 1 million.
And you want yours to be at least 12 seconds. If everybody else is 10, you don't need to run faster than the bear. You just need to run faster than the person next to you.
Yep. Yeah, so there's the low-hanging fruit is the easy stuff to go after, which is the password manager and two-factor auth. And those are easy to get into the practice of using. And then browser ad blocking plugins, just add one of those in, and then you pretty much just leave it and forget about it.
I don't do that enough. I feel a little guilty sometimes because I do want the site to go to be supported. but they are also
Yeah, that's
scummy,
the problem.
So it's tough. And then I end up not going to those places anyway because...
Have you ever clicked on any of the ads that support these sites? Then you're not supporting them anyway.
Oh, well, one actually, Q Overload used to have an ad that I liked.
But they already went out of business, so...
That's true. Okay, let's switch topics entirely for a little while. I think I can't stand any more security today.
Okay.
What do you do with ham radio?
I'm one of those hams that doesn't really like talking to people. So I have, right now my rack is being rebuilt, but normally I have a radio dedicated to APRS, which is just an automatic packet system that reports telemetry and position data. So I have a station that gates that to the internet and then will gate messages from other users to each other, either from the air to the internet or vice versa. I have an HF radio that I do some digital stuff on. There are a bunch of digital text modes that have very low communications rates, but really good resistance to noise. Basically, some of them are below the noise floor, like, for example, the Whisper system that Christopher, you've talked about. It takes 2 minutes to send, 13 bytes?
Yeah.
And with 200 milliwatts, you can be heard round the world. I have a thing up on my tower that listens to local aircraft position beacons, so I can see who's flying around me.
How big of a tower do you have?
It's a 30-foot tower.
Oh, my.
So I live in a sort of a semi-rural area down on the Central Coast. So I have not a massive backyard, but it's big enough. And I was able to drop a huge chunk of concrete into the ground and build this thing up in the air.
It's going to make me feel guilty that I keep suggesting Christopher just tie his antenna to a bolt and throw it in a tree.
Wait, that was how I started. I mean, that's that was my idea.
It's true.
I don't have any trees, though, so...
My antenna doesn't work very well. I have other problems. Antennas are the big mystery for ham radio for me. I can do all the other stuff, and then I get to antennas, and I don't understand anything people are talking about. I don't understand how to make this work. I can never make the SWR do what it's supposed to. It just...
Vertical.
There's all these...
Horizontal.
There's all these...
Impedance.
Inductors and things and coils and transformers, and it's like, this is the worst part of electronics.
Don't lick the high power antenna.
Just think of it as wiggling a Slinky.
Yeah, but it's a Slinky with a lot of math.
Yeah. So yeah, ham radio is really, for me, it's just another part of tinkering with electronics, and yeah, I just like RF stuff as well as the others.
Yeah, cool. But do you ever actually talk to the ham radio people? I mean, do you do the whole
the ham radio people
QC?
So
this is Nick, the exploding lemur, and
occasionally. So I've done some contesting. Usually when we do Field Day, which is the big nationwide ham radio quote preparedness exercise, which is mostly an excuse for people to grab their radios, go out into a park, and look weird in front of everyone. I've done some talking on that, which can be fun. I kind of like the contesting better than the rag chewing, because you make your contact and move on.
You don't have to have any social aspect.
Yeah. I joke that I don't have enough health problems to really rag chew on HF.
Yeah.
And saying that's going to get a lot of people mad at me, but I'm sorry.
I've made comments, so.
I'm in favor of these preparedness days, and I like them. But then I go hang out with the emergency people, and they have better contests for me, because they're trying to optimize where people should go and which fire trucks should go here versus there and how many people will be saved. And I'm just like, well, yeah, I can make contacts, or I can just optimize this and do all the paperwork for you, and you guys can all just go drink coffee. That's great. It's a different skill set.
There's a set of classes that I think FEMA has available.
Oh, the community emergency response classes. Yeah, those are response training, CERT.
Yes, CERT is one. So CERT is the like the local stuff. But FEMA also runs a bunch of different stuff about emergency management.
Yes.
And they
have a big bunch of online classes too.
Yeah, those are the ones. I can't remember what they're called.
Oh, it's in my CERT packet, I'm sure, because I've taken a couple.
Yeah. It's all about incident response and incident management systems or service whatnot. Basically, how you organize an incident response with different agencies, that sort of thing.
Yes, and who gets to be in charge? Has to be in charge.
Who handles the buying the food and who handles the paying for the fuel for all the fire trucks and et cetera, et cetera.
And you're on the team if they feed you packaged food. If it's actually an emergency, eat the packaged food. That's one of the things I learned in CERT class.
Yep.
All right. I think maybe we should go back to our weekends, and I desperately want to put my head back into the sand as soon as I install an ad blocker.
You don't have an ad blocker already?
I have one on my iPad, but I don't think I have one on my... I mean, I run Chrome. I think it has an ad blocker. I have no idea. I don't see ads very often because I only go to the same 5 websites.
And 2 of them are yours.
Well, and one of them is Wikipedia, so... Chris, do you have any other questions you want to ask Nick? Okay. Nick, do you have any thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
So I do have one thought that might sound like kind of a downer. It's kind of serious and different topic, but something that I think is important to talk about. So a colleague of mine a few months ago took her own life rather suddenly. And I just want to make sure to kind of have a reminder for all those listening that there are services available to help. There are people to listen, and there's always somebody that you can reach out to. And for those that may have somebody in their life that is struggling and you think may need some help, there are resources for you as well to look into to see how you can help and maybe get them some help or be there to listen for them.
I think it was on the last show with Chris Gamble where I said one of my goals for 2018 is better mental health because, depression lies. Depression tells you you're not good enough. It tells you it will never get better. It tells you there's no hope. And those are lies that are very easy to believe. And if you are believing those, there's help. Get help. It does get better. All right. Now that we're all riled up, Nick, I'm going to say thank you.
Sorry.
No, it's a tough topic and we shouldn't ignore it.
Yeah.
And I know it's odd, but we don't talk about it enough.
There is in information security. There's a large population of those afflicted with depression and other issues. There was a talk actually at DEF CON several years ago specifically about mental health and information security. As there have been a number of suicides and it is something that exists that affects a large number of people, and just ignoring it is not going to help anyone.
And I will throw out that there's this site called makeitokay.org. And it's a site that is trying to make it so we can talk more about mental health in the same way we would talk about having a broken leg. It's not an embarrassing thing. It's something you just have to, it's not good, but you can deal with it. And so if you know somebody, maybe look there for resources. That they're not the only place. There are a lot of them. but don't think I'll do it next week. Do it today. Our guest has been Nick Kartsioukas, security engineer and exploding lemur. Thank you for being with us, Nick. This was very helpful.
Thank you guys so much for having me on.
Thank you to Christopher for producing and co-hosting. And of course, thank you for listening. I have a quote to leave you with. I had something more serious, but now we're going to go for funny from John Cleese in his autobiography, in which he explains that swearing was one of the things he was famous for. And then he goes on to say, "This, incidentally, is one of my 3 claims to fame. The others are that I have a species of lemur named after me, and that I was once French kissed on camera by Tim Curry." Embedded is an independently produced radio show that focuses on the many aspects of engineering. It is a production of Logical Elegance, an embedded software consulting company in California. If there are advertisements in the show, we did not put them there and do not receive money from them. At this time, our sponsors are Logical Elegance and listeners like you.